everybody. Welcome to your MyPath MiniCast. I am one of your hosts, Tenecia Waddell-Pyle.
And I am her co-host, John Soderberg. And we're switching up our format, and we're going to just jump straight into the thick of it with our Rumor Has It segment. This comes out of our minicast from last month, and the rumor is microaggressions aren't actually micro. So, or are they?
Or are they? Yeah, so that's our rumor.
So what is a microaggression?
Yeah, so a microaggression is considered by definition. So like if you hear what the EEOC says and other things that are put out, is that microaggressions are often subtle, often unintentional, everyday verbal and nonverbal slights, insults, or behaviors that communicate hostility, derogatory attitudes, or negative assumptions about individuals or a group based on their marginalized identities.
Yeah, and I think, right, so I will not argue with the EEOC's definition, but where I always get hung up on, and I think other people could, is around the idea that they're unintentional, right? So whenever you start to use, for me, and I guess we should use the disclaimer, we're expressing personal experience and opinion, but when you start to say and use the word aggression to me is a choice, right? There's intentionality, and it's a strong word.
You're choosing violence.
You're choosing violence. I say that, and I'm like, well, they're choosing violence.
Chose violence.
Yeah, and I feel like sometimes we use the word micro in front of it to try to minimize what it is and not really take into context. They could have a major impact on the actual individual. One, and two, intentionality. That's where I really do struggle, right? Because people unintentionally make mistakes.
They do.
And I wouldn't consider those things as aggressive acts towards me,
right.
As an underrepresented person, right? So that's where I kind of struggle on that term, right?
Yeah, I do too, because you cannot, whatever your intent was, it does not dismiss the impact. So a lot of times people, like you said, will try to sugarcoat it and be like, oh, it's a microaggression. Well, it just literally was just aggression. So just call it what it is. It was an aggression. And often we just try to put that in front of it to make it seem subtle, which also maybe that person that was the contributor to that microaggression even sends a message to them like, oh, it probably wasn't that big of a deal, even though it really was. And when these microaggressions happen or aggressions happen, that impact that it can have on marginalized communities or marginalized identities can be huge, to the point that it can cause psychological harm. It can cause all sorts of things that can really affect that person, whether in that moment or even in a long term or even years later because of what they experienced.
And maybe that's what I don't connect the dots on, right? Like is if you do something unintentionally once, I correct you and you don't ever do it again, that's just a faux
teachable
pas,
moment.
right?
It's
like
a teachable
versus would microaggressions be something where because somebody has such a strong bias, right? Even unconsciously, we've corrected it, they've apologized, but they kind of continue to do it. Is that when it borders into, well, now it is really microaggression, not just a mistake.
And it's very intentional. You know, and that's
I still think there's intent.
There's intent.
But people will still say, I forgot, or it's hard for me to remember, or I didn't mean it.
I didn't mean to. And again, that's when I say, again, what your intent was does not disregard the impact that it has on that marginalized identity or person. You've been informed, and now that you know better, you need to do better. But if you don't and you continue to do it, then that still is a microaggression or aggression towards that person. Yeah. Because you're continuing to do it even after you know better.
Right. I do think at that point we can just retire the word micro. But I get it,
right? Like, And I mean, and then it leads into, when we talk about macro, because then we can go into macroaggressions, but that a lot of times has to do with the system. So systemic injustices or things that are happening systemically in an organization or within a group of, or in a community. But macro can also mean that it's very overt. So meaning that, there was no subtlety about this. This was 100% intentional. So that is a macro aggression at that point. But at the end of the day, it's still an aggression, So I think sometimes we get too hung up on the micro and the macro of it and just focusing on exactly what it is. When people show aggression or choose violence, that is a problem.
That's a problem.
Whether it's physical violence, verbal violence, psychological violence, it's all causing harm in some sort of way.
Yeah.
So,
and I think, Tenecia and I talked that everybody's processes and deals and handles things differently. So something that could be micro to me might be macro to you. So who defines that? Who says, right? Like sometimes I'm like, I have a higher tolerance for some behaviors than somebody else might. But the reality is it doesn't dismiss or excuse that person's behavior just because I can tolerate a higher level in some places, and in some places I probably can't tolerate as much as others. But so it becomes really hard when you're defining the impact on the individual and the intentionality of the person. And I agree, at the end of the day, aggression's aggression. It's a choice, right?
And you can't blanket like the experience, like you said. So like what is micro to you, you can't assume like, well, everybody from this community or everybody from this racial group all experience it the same way. That's not true. Because maybe you have someone that you talk to or somebody that you've interacted with that accepts whatever behavior or language or attitudes or interactions that you have. That doesn't mean that's going to be the same for me or somebody else that you interact with. So not blanketing, these things and thinking that, just because this person experiences, that means that this next person is going to feel the same way about it. So that's important to think about.
And I think that can be hard and confusing for folks because, right, sometimes within your friend group, there may be allowable behaviors and people understand your heart, right? So you may say things that you hopefully don't say in other places. But what you're calling out there is just because it's unacceptable and this dynamic with this individual or this person or this relationship, don't assume that across everybody you meet, right? Because they maybe don't know your heart and their experiences are different. So. So I get it, and I get that people can be kind of loose in group friendships. I just try to be very intentional no matter what the dynamic is, right? And just realize there's just certain things I don't say or do. And I don't care if it's with my friends or not.
Right.
But for other people, they're different, and their dynamic's different. But I do think that's hard for people to understand. Well, I can say it here, and it's okay with my friend XYZ. Right. So why are you so mad? Right. And I'm like, because I'm not your friend XYZ. I'm a completely different human being with different experience. I'm not your friend. Whatever it may be. Right? But it's hard. It's hard for people to navigate this dynamic. Right.
It is. But the main thing is to just realize that when these things happen, that, they can be very harmful. You may think that it's trivial. You may think that, it's not that big of a deal because you aren't the person experiencing it. But you also have to be empathetic and know that there's things that you may have experienced in your life that you didn't like. And you may have somebody say, it's not that big of a deal. And think about how that made you feel. Think about how that hit you. And maybe some things that you even think about that can happen earlier in life, recently, or maybe several years back. And how does it still affect you today? Right. Today, that still has an impact on you. So we just really need to make sure that we realize that we're treating people with the proper dignity and respect and support that they need.
Yeah. And I think ultimately listening to each other. Right. Like I've said it, I'm sure, before on this. I do at all times try to assume noble intention. I do think most people at their base are good and mean well. Right. So if we come into a situation where you say something I don't like or I don't find appropriate, I'll provide you that teachable moment in education and then go forward from there. I'll assume noble intention and then go forward from there. And so I think people need to also have that grace to understand I'll reserve my judgment for our following interactions and how you behave and if you took that learning to heart or you didn't. And then usually I'm the sort that the only thing I can really control is myself, right? So if that dynamic doesn't shift or change, then we're probably not friends and we're just not going to hang out, right? I'm not going to spend my life and time trying to continuously re-educate you. Right.
Because that causes harm. That causes harm on you. And that, educating is very important. So, even when people are like, well, I didn't know, I didn't mean to, or something like that. Okay, well, let's lean into that. Let's take this moment to educate you, to teach you, and to realize why that wasn't okay, right? And after that, but if you continue to do it or continue to think like, oh, I'm just going to do it anyway because this is what my views are, and not listen to that person and have that understanding that caused harm to them, then like you said, at that point, it's just like, okay, I'm not going to keep reliving this trauma with you or these triggers with you by continuing to be around you. Then I'm just going to remove myself from the situation or friendship with you or workspace with you or report it or whatever it is that you need to do to make sure that you have the opportunity to feel safe and not experience the aggression.
Yeah.
So,
because that's what you can control.
Yeah.
Right?
So that's what you can control.
So yeah, rumor has it, microaggressions, are they micro or not? I mean, I guess the reality of that is yes and no. A lot of that depends on the individual and the intentionality behind it. But personal stance, aggression is a choice. And if you choose violence, then you're choosing violence.
Yeah.
But I'll assume you're nobly intended at first.
Yeah. We can turn it into a teachable moment if that's there. But if it's not, you're choosing violence, and that is not okay. And it will be addressed accordingly.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So what else?
Yeah. So we were going to focus on talk about our monthly awareness highlights at the end. So one of the things that you guys may have noticed is that, well, like I've been talking about since the beginning of the year, is that we switched to using Global ERG Network's calendars. They are a shorter version, abbreviated, and just, gives more micro content, I guess, using the word micro again. And if you want more macro content, more highlights, you can actually go back to the Work Ready app and look at those previous highlights, because those are, they're a deeper dive. They have more information, and the older ones do have more highlights. So even if you're still trying to navigate your workspaces or trying to figure out, hey, what's going on this month, you can look at that Gen calendar and see some of the things. But if you want a deeper dive, I would still highly, highly encourage you to go back into the Work Ready app to look at those previous ones, because they are more robust. But I also would like to hear feedback. So if you like the new calendar format that's coming out, let me know. If you think like, it's kind of missing the mark, I don't like it, you can let me know that as well. If you think that the old calendars are great and you want to see those come back, I would love to hear that. So any feedback that you have on what the calendars are for 2024 and what they have been since 2021, feedback is welcome.
Sounds good. Mm-hmm. And with that, we are out for the month of May, and we will end with your monthly awareness highlights and see you next month.
See you next month.
Bye.